So we've experimented the last 2 days with our maps and removing certain parties, and I thought, why not overhaul the complete US system and put the UK parties in instead. So if we go to the UK 2024 general election results, Labour, Conservative, Reform, Lib Dem, Green, they're the ones we're including on here. Scottish National Party, of course, in the US, I don't know where you see in Scotland. Maybe in a complete fantasy world you could make New England a version of Scotland and, make the policies cater towards there. We're not changing the policies of the parties, and that would kind of be ridiculous. So Scottish National Party not in here. Northern Irish Party is the same. Plaid Cymru again the same. The Workers' Party, I mean, I got to draw the line somewhere, and they got less than 1% of the vote, the popular vote, and they got 0 seats. So the Workers' Party, that's where I draw the line, unfortunately. So we've got the UK election results up here, just to look where we need to, and we can go straight onto the map. We could, where should we start? We'll start up in Maine, and we'll give it to the Conservatives. So the rural areas, as you can see on this map, tend to go Conservative. The bigger constituencies that are not in the cities tend to vote Conservative. They tend to be more right wing. And then you get London, Birmingham, as you can see, where there's a higher concentration of constituencies because it's a city, they're going to be voting for Labour, and perhaps Green Party could get a little bit more traction than it does in the US at the moment. The problem is, so you look at the UK, let's take any constituency, random constituency, South Northamptonshire. How many votes is there? Roughly 50,000 in here. In the US, each state is a few million. So you're talking about, you're going to need a big budget. It's not like, Green Party focusing on North Herefordshire, which is tiny, and you could almost go door to door in these places. If the Green Party wanted to win Vermont, that's a big difference compared to winning Hereford. So really, are Green going to get any seats? Probably not. But they can impact the vote share. Are Reform going to get any seats? If they couldn't, so Reform picked off 4 seats from Conservatives, 3 of which, or 5 seats in total, which obviously they're just up against Conservatives in these races. One of them's Clacton, which obviously leader seat, you get a sway there. Lee Anderson had a lot of momentum in Ashfield as a key figure in the party, as did Richard Tice in Boston. So, but you can't take it away from them. But they've only won 2 races outside of that, whereas Conservative have won 112. So really, on a mass scale, are Reform going to beat Conservative in any way? No. They will impact the vote share, and the vote splitting will make a difference, and Labour will probably win this. I can tell you that right now. But I don't really think they're going to win anything. Immigration is kind of different, a different sort of problem in the US. So maybe it will impact the results, but we'll keep an eye on that. Last thing. So Conservatives they tend to be the more capitalist, business-focused party, much like the Democrats, I believe. The Republicans tend to be the more worker rights type of party, just like Labour. They tend to be more towards the working man. So really the parties can be opposite and the same. So Labour in that respect are similar to Republicans, but obviously they're left wing, Republicans are right wing. Well, Labour are left wing in theory, Conservative again complete opposite to Democrats. So we'll keep that in mind. Maine, this second district, I actually think will go to a lean margin over Reform, because I think you're talking about a district, so it's a lot smaller. So if Reform were going to win anywhere, it would be this district. Maybe immigration's not such a problem actually in Maine, so maybe you could bump it up to a likely. Lib Dems would probably get a good vote share up here. Labour would probably get a good vote share. Reform, I think, would still get a good vote share, even though immigration's not a problem. Just the further right, not far right, but further right than the Conservative Party tends to be. And Green and they've got a sort of a charismatic leader. I do think that can make a difference. And Green, in this part of the country, tend to do a bit better. So that would be a very close race, I think, actually, between the five of them. And then you've got this district, this smaller district down here, which tends to vote Democrat, tends to be quite liberal. If we go on to Maine, and we have a quick look at the first district, as you can see here, the Republicans don't do very well. So probably looking at Labour tends to be more liberal rather than moderates. So I don't think Lib Dems would be able to take that one home. We move on to New Hampshire. So Green, this is their best chance at taking a win, I think. As you can see, Green, well, we can actually just go to the average here. 6% of total votes across England and Wales. So maybe in Vermont and New Hampshire they'd get up to maybe 10, but I don't think that impacts Labour all too much, because Reform are probably taking 5 to 10 off of them in each state. So really we'll see. Again, immigration's a bit more of an isolated issue in the US. Certain states it really doesn't make an impact all that much, and well, many other states it really makes an impact. So really Reform's results are going to fluctuate quite viciously, but I do think New Hampshire, we can go to 538 and we can look at the polling, tends to be more liberal. Again, I think once you split the Reform vote, you're probably looking at Conservative maybe around 26%, or maybe 30. Labour at about 35. Green at 10. Reform at 5, and Lib Dems at 10 or 15, whatever makes up the 100. So New Hampshire, I think we'd go to Labour fairly comfortably. We have Vermont, which is definitely a blue state here. Definitely more further left in their ideology, so I think that would be pretty safe as a Labour seat. We can go to Maine at large as well. We can look at Maine at large and say a little bit more right wing. I mean, if we've got Labour winning this district the most comfortably, and this is the more populated district, I do think Labour take it home then. Probably by a safe margin. I guess you could put it as likely, but probably by a safe margin. Then we get down to Massachusetts, Connecticut, and Rhode. Again, I think these are really, really liberal states. Rhode, definitely. Kennedy's doing quite well there. Rhode Island, probably you're looking at Lib Dems being the competition here, but New England, I think, is going to vote fairly similar. Rhode Island there, a safe spot. Then we have Connecticut, which would go to... Perhaps Conservative could do a little bit better here. It's a smaller state. It's perhaps not got the rural areas you'd want, but in terms of, you know, being more business focused, corporation focused, maybe it would be a more competitive race. Maybe Lib Dems could do a little bit better here. Just think there's too many liberal people in this area to really make that flip to a right-wing party. And then Massachusetts, again, right-wing party in the absolute gutter. It's not going to be this simple throughout the rest of the country, but I do think here it is. DC, I'm going to give to Conservatives because it tends to vote for these blue, more sophisticated parties. I say that very loosely. New Jersey, we are looking at really interesting polls out of New Jersey for the US election. But New Jersey, okay, a lot of liberal people, not many rural areas. Really, immigration not a massive issue. Don't think there's many moderates, so I think it's just a Labour win. Because these are in New York City, you've got obviously in New York State, that's a Labour safe haven. So again, I think Labour just takes it home very comfortably. I mean, I guess the rural areas in New York go to Conservative at that point, but I think overall it's a Labour wipeout in New England, apart from this main district and DC, which is not in New England. Well, it depends what you consider New England. We have Delaware, which I think would go to Conservative, actually. Perhaps it's a little bit more liberal, but I do think the business focus would be the difference maker there. I think it would be just as well over the edge. Black turnout actually is another thing to consider in these areas. Maryland would probably then go to Labour just on a lean. Really, this is looking bad for Conservative already. Where should we go next? Pennsylvania's sticking out there a bit like a sore thumb. Obviously, we know what Pennsylvania is looking like at the moment, but we have to say, I think again, it's technically a Rust Belt state in this western area. Maybe rural more in eastern Pennsylvania, central Pennsylvania. Probably still a Labour win, again by a fairly solid margin. Another thing we have to consider, so the UK, obviously we're not taking into account abortion, we're not taking into account immigration in the way that the US takes it into account. It's very different, and we're not taking into account guns. So really, a lot of key issues you can't really, that there is no basis on it because it's not being discussed in the UK. So very hard to kind of, maybe the deep south states, what are they voting? Religious values are sort of, if you're going to pick any of these five parties in terms of respecting religious values or promoting them at least, it's reform. But reform's number one thing is immigration. Immigration maybe not so much of a problem. So we'll get into that. West Virginia, definitely a right-wing state, right-wing stronghold, and as you can see, that is a massive margin. So maybe you get a couple more further right voters here, but again, I think it is a fairly comfortable Conservative win, to be honest. So Conservatives at 11. I think Kentucky would be more of the same. Virginia, okay. So right now Virginia's fairly even, although not a lot of polls coming out recently. Now this would be a sort of maybe a Maryland situation. I think I'm going to say now. I think North Carolina would probably go to Conservative, but you're going to tend to get more black crossover in Republican than you are to Conservative. So maybe Labour would edge this one just by the black turnout and the difference that could make. Virginia, we have here, I really think it would maybe go to Labour. Again, it's so hard because there's no real, you can't talk about abortion, you can't talk about guns, you can't talk about immigration in the same context. Maybe you could talk about economically. And having been, I guess it would be, what is the scenario if you're coming off of a US Joe Biden led administration where they've been false promises and the economy's nowhere. Perhaps you go to a Conservative who maybe, Labour have got a history of maybe not following up to what they say in the UK. I'm not saying Conservative don't either, but Labour, I'd say to a larger degree. So maybe economically you'd think Conservative would maybe have the edge. Maybe Lib Dems, maybe there's a lot of moderates in Virginia now. It's moving right, but maybe this is the perfect storm for Lib Dems to go and take in Virginia. While it's moderate right now, as it's in the process of trending to the right, but that may not stay the same. I think I'd give it to Lib Dems. We'll get Lib Dems on the board. So South Carolina, definitely far more right wing, not far right, but more right wing. And Georgia, the same. So Reform. This is where Reform will do the best in the Deep South down here. So we're probably it's Tennessee, Louisiana, Arkansas, Mississippi, Alabama, Georgia, South Carolina. These, what is that, 7 states are all going to tend to vote quite similar. Maybe Georgia with a bigger black voting population. But South Carolina, Georgia. I think it would be, if Reform were going to win any, I think it would be South Carolina. I don't think they are, just because, again, immigration really, it's not lining up. It's just more racist voters. So probably a lean conservative, but Reform would be up there in a smaller state as well. Georgia would probably, this would be where Lib Dems and Labour start to come into it, but probably Conservative would take Georgia, even with the black vote. Tennessee, it depends on, are voters gonna want religious values and traditional values to be valued, and would they be willing to vote Reform in that case? I'm not so sure. I still think Reform is some way off. So I think Tennessee would go fairly likely to Conservative just because it's right wing, and I don't think you're ready to vote Reform. Alabama the same, Mississippi the same, Louisiana the same, Arkansas the same. So Conservative really have built up there. Although Florida, Florida again, Lib Dems could do quite well here, Conservative could do quite well here. We look at London on this electoral map, and as you get into sort of South London on the outskirts, or just the edge of London by Wimbledon, and these southern areas, Sutton, you tend to get it's all red, and then you apart from Jeremy Corbyn in Islington, and then it starts to sort of bleed orange down here, and then you get on the outskirts of London and you start seeing a bit more conservative wins. So Florida, as a metro, a very heavily metro area, but it's still got its rural parts, probably slightly more right wing than it is left wing, but at the same time you've got Reform there. Hispanics are down there. What would they be voting? Probably not Labour, certainly not Green. Maybe Lib Dems would be a bit more competitive here. They certainly wouldn't win it, but maybe they'd be more competitive. Reform would get a decent vote share. Maybe they'd be 3rd or 4th on the vote share. Conservative and Labour. Ooh, this would be Bush Gore. I think it would be a real toss-up. I think I'd probably go Labour, given the current climate of the Conservative Party. They don't actually have a leader at the moment, so I don't really know how that factors into this map. We'll probably say they just have one decided, just for simplicity. I still think Florida would go Labour, though. We could make that a tilt, even. Ohio, I think this is a Labour win by a lean. Similar situation to Pennsylvania. Michigan, another one, probably further towards Labour because of the black vote. Illinois, probably safe for Labour. Indiana's probably a bit more right wing itself. So Indiana, yeah, I mean the Democrats are nowhere in Indiana. Maybe you could slip it to Conservative. Immigration is a problem in Illinois, so maybe Reform would probably be a second place party in Illinois, but it wouldn't be enough. Wisconsin, we're probably looking at another Labour win. With the working class people, the white working class people, very willing to vote Labour. Probably win for Labour there. Minnesota, another win for Labour, probably safe. Maybe you could make a case that Michigan's safe. Iowa would be an interesting one. Let's go to the mountain states. So again, I don't think Reform has enough to really take these. I think Conservative would be the ones taking these states, maybe Nebraska. I think Lib Dems would actually win this second district in Nebraska by a lean, because I think there's more moderates in that area of the country, in that district. I mean, but I think all these mountain states, Utah, again, Reform could do quite well in Utah, but do they value Reform's religious standpoint enough to vote for them? They will vote for third party very willingly, so perhaps Reform could take a Utah, and I think it would be okay. You can make that a lean Conservative then because of Reform, but again, I just don't think Montana, Idaho, Wyoming, North South, Nebraska, North South Dakota, I just don't think they're going there. We've got Missouri. That would probably be a Conservative, probably safe. Maybe just a lot of rural areas. I think it would go probably safe. Iowa, I think, would be a likely. Kansas. So with Lib Dems, so now this takes 7 off. So 263 is now the winning margin. So Labour are not quite there. We do have California to go, which I think will be the final nail in the coffin. Kansas. So it tends to be right wing. They were willing to vote DeSantis, which just shows that they're not really, Trumped. They're not all about Trump, and it is a right wing focus. So really, Conservative probably take home Kansas. They probably take home Oklahoma, smaller state. I think they take that. I think Texas. Ooh, Texas is an interesting one. Really interesting one. Texas would maybe go. Oh, this would be a really tough one. So you've got Reform would do quite well down here. Maybe Green would be underrated in Texas. Lib Dems, there's a lot of moderates in Texas. Maybe you could get them on side. I think, but I still think Lib Dems would be fourth in the vote share. I think Reform would be third in this case. Conservatives would be fighting Labour for the win. It just depends on Reform's vote share. How much would they get? And the metro areas, I think Labour get the edge. I think they take Texas, and that puts them at 260, and then they would win Colorado by a mile, with all the Californians moving there, and it's just far more liberal. I think they'd win that by a strong margin. Maybe if you include Lib Dems' vote share, it's not so safe, but still 8-9%, sure. New Mexico the same, Arizona the same, maybe a little bit closer with Lib Dems. Nevada with the a lot of hospitality, culinary workers, these people, working class people, or people on lower wages. Labour would, in theory, seek to protect these people. California, I think, would probably just go completely Labour, to be honest, with how liberal. It's just so liberal, and that's the difference maker. Lib Dems, I really don't think would be able to pull through much. I mean, you take London as an example, but if we were to look at Manchester, okay, two constituencies sort of on the outskirts there. You look at Newcastle, completely red. You look at Birmingham, completely red with some outskirts going to Conservative. Norwich, completely red. Leicester was split between Conservative and an independent. Labour and independent, but Labour won anyway. So once again, these liberal area, or these metro areas, Bristol, another one, they're all going to Labour. So you have to think California, you've got Los Angeles, you've got San Francisco. These places are not a single district is thinking about voting Conservative. You do have the rural areas, of course, but I just don't think they make up enough of the electorate to really make the difference there. Maybe Lib Dems would do a little bit better. Certainly Lib Dems in this northern part of the country, with their stance on Israel and just the foreign policy in general, I think they could do a little bit better, perhaps, than expected. So maybe you could give them a New Hampshire or a Vermont. Maybe not a Vermont, but New Hampshire definitely would be in play. Then we got Oregon, which I think you include the rural areas, they're probably voting Conservative. Reform probably aren't getting a lot. Maybe Lib Dems would get a bit of the share, but it would probably be a 33 for Labour, maybe 28 for Conservative, 23 or so for Lib Dems, and then Reform and Green hoover up whatever's left. Washington the same, and then you've got Alaska and Hawaii. So Alaska again. So you think, well, Alaska, that's sort of your typical Reform sort of place. I'm not so sure, because immigration really not so much of an issue again. There, I really think just Conservative would take it fairly comfortably, because it is so rural. There's no metro areas really. So you'd probably say Alaska would go Conservative as their right-wing alternative. And then Hawaii, this is where Green Party I think would be in with the best shout of a win. Reform are not getting anything in Hawaii. Conservative are not getting anything in Hawaii. Lib Dem maybe would be up there. Maybe they'd be second or third. I think Green would genuinely be second in the vote share here. It's the smallest state. But again, I really think it would just be a Labour win fairly comfortably. If you want to make it likely, then go ahead. But I think Labour absolutely dominates. And if we look at the results here, Labour 370 to 154, 14 for Lib Dems. They do get on the board in Virginia and Nebraska 2nd District. Reform takes 0, Green takes 0, but they do impact the vote share in certain places. Certainly Reform in Texas, maybe they are the reason that Texas doesn't go Conservative. But again, it wouldn't make a difference. Labour would win by over 100 points. So again, really a Labour wipeout in this case. Conservative really not translating all too well to the US in the sort of, business focused areas: Washington, Oregon, Connecticut, Rhode, Massachusetts. You're losing because the people there are so liberal, but then so you're only winning rural areas, and where Reform maybe in 4 years' time, if we did this again, would probably win in South Carolina at the very least. I think they'd take Georgia. I don't think they would take, but I think then Georgia would probably go something to like Labour. But then you'd win Alabama, Mississippi, perhaps Louisiana. I mean, Louisiana and Mississippi would kind of be in the same boat. Tennessee, you'd win, and then you'd really close the gap on Conservative there. But I think it's just too early for Reform at the moment. You really couldn't put them in that bracket. But I think overall, this is the map we'll go with. A fairly comfortable win for the Labour Party in the US.